a very special Martin amongst the modern Martin category. This is a Sinker Mahogany Gruen Special. So a Gruen Special is a custom shop model that is built for Gruen Guitars in Nashville, Tennessee. Gruen Guitars is the premier guitar store in the world and the premier vintage guitar store. George Gruen has been in the business since the late 60s, and his store in Nashville is truly kind of the center of the guitar buying world. George is a genius of the guitar, or just a tome of information. I've spent a lot of time with George in the recent months, and I've got to see a lot of Gruen specials, and I can only say that these are probably going to be the most desirable Martins in the next 30 to 50 years. Their build quality compared to other Martins is second to none. They really they've been made in small batches of about 50 to 100 to 200 guitars over the space of a year or 2 years, and that means that the builders at Martin really get up to cruising speed as far as making the same model over and over again, and then they're also going through George's store, and they're being observed by George himself and his employees, who are all very capable musicians and very knowledgeable about the guitars themselves. When I was there, they would have, say, 10 of these would come in every week, and the guys would go through and play them all and tune them up, and anyone that was particularly special would get pulled out. But these things were flying off the shelf. And for the Sinker Mahogany, if you're not aware of the story of the Sinker Mahogany, in Belize, where they were harvesting mahogany trees back about 100 years ago, they were floating the logs down the river, and every now and again they'd get a little bit too greedy on how big the trees could be, and every now and again a tree would actually just sink into the river. And back then it's kind of like, well, how do you get an entire tree out of the bottom of a river? In the last few years, they've figured out how to retrieve this wood, how to float it and then get it out of the river. And so now you have these 100-year-old trees that have been underwater for their entire time that they've been cut down, and they've been shipped to Martin and then getting turned into guitars for George. And my understanding is George, or Gruen Guitars, have purchased all of the Sinker, and so they kind of have their run on this type of wood, and so they're making all of the guitars from Martin that have been made in Sinker Mahogany. They made all the mahogany Martin guitars have been turned into Sinker models, and then you have models like this. This particular model is a 4-aught, so 4 O's. So in Martin you have a single O, double O, triple O, and then you have the 4-O. So the 4-O, or 4-aught as they're kind of called, is a design of George's. The 4-aught is kind of in between the triple O, which is your OM size body, and a D28, your dreadnought body size. So the story goes that in the 30s and 40s, Martin were making arch tops in this body size with an arch top, and they in the 60s and 70s, as people were getting hold of these guitars, they were taking the arch top off and then retopping it as a flat top, and so you started having these slightly bigger OM or O size guitars appearing. And this design is something that George has brought forward. George, with all of his wisdom in guitars, he designed this guitar, seeing that there was a kind of a hole within the Martin range of, okay, we can have an OM but slightly bigger, but also thinner. It's not as deep as a D28, which means it's very, very comfortable to play. It's very easy to hold against the body. I guess I can talk all day about the Gruen specials because they're so impressive. I think you'd have to spend kind of twice the amount, new pricing, you had to spend twice the amount to get a high-end Martin from the custom shop that's of the same quality. ultimately, when they all go through the store and George gets to look at them, George is the one that's doing the quality control. So, what does the Sinker Mahogany offer you? It offers you a sound that's comparable to standard mahogany, if not better. Being old growth is kind of where it's at. Old trees, not newer trees that have grown say in the last 100 years, trees that were growing 200-300 years ago. That means the wood is just more mature and more desirable, ultimately, for guitar building. So what we have here, aside from it being a 4/0 Sinker Mahogany, is we have a shade top, which also is kind of highly desirable. The shade tops within the Martin range are few and far between, so that's why George has kind of revived the look. They really go well. And then this is also a slotted 12 fret, so you have the slotted headstock, which is kind of a more vintage Martin thing. Personally, I like the slotted headstock more. I think it has a better sound to your standard headstock. And then your 12 fret, that makes it a great guitar for all sorts of playing. Namely, if you're a classical guitar player, this is a great steel string to transition to because you're working with 12 frets, not 14 frets, so it's a bit easier to navigate. But also, you get a lot of clarity out of this design. And I guess the last thing to mention, I haven't even mentioned yet, is your top is Adirondack, which is another kind of story that involves George and his development of Martin guitars. Adirondack was the sought after wood in the 30s and 40s, up until the World War II. End of World War II was the sought after wood for guitar tops for its strength and its clarity in sound. But as World War II kind of ended, the US had exhausted all of its supplies of Adirondack wood, and really between 45 and 1990. The belief was that Adirondack had kind of disappeared. In George's writings in the early 70s about vintage Martins and what made them so special, he singled out Adirondack as being a contributing factor, or probably the main factor that made the guitars so outstanding. And it was in the 80s and 90s that guitar builders and people like George started to search for Adirondack, and eventually they found that the species hadn't been completely harvested, and that essentially people had kind of forgotten what the tree exactly looks like, and through some hunting around in the woods they found this wood again, and now Martin is offering it on most of their guitars. So really what you would say about this Martin and Martins made in the last 15 years is that they are reaching the quality that they were that they had set in the 30s and 40s for guitars. So really the best Martins that you can get today, aside from a vintage one, are the modern ones of the last 15 years. And this Sinker Adirondack shade top 12 fret slotted headstock is probably your standout model as far as a combination of key factors that make a great guitar. So what you're kind of hearing here is you're hearing that low end of a D28 or a Dreadnought model. But you're also hearing kind of a more focused sound than you would from a Dreadnought. So this guitar lends itself very well to finger picking. So let's do some of that. With probably an hour or so playing of kind of this style of playing, really putting a lot of sound through it, you'll find the guitar will really open up and wake up, so to speak. So let's said about this instrument. I think I've already said enough. It really speaks for itself, doesn't it? As far as New Zealand is concerned, you're not going to really see a lot of sinker mahogany guitars down here. They are relatively rare, and certainly this would be one of the only Gruen specials that are in the country. I have personally had an older version before the sinker wood came in. I have a 4/0 Madagascar and Adirondack top guitar that I've been playing a lot, and it's very similar to this, just a joy to play. And the 4/0, the larger body, wider diameter on the top and thinner, just is a different characteristic. It's kind of surprising that Martin didn't do this themselves first, but that's what kind of happens. You have development over 10 years, and new models are developed and new trends are established. So this isn't your standard acoustic guitar music, especially for America, but in New Zealand, the kind of dub reggae thing. This guitar, listen to just the response. You can really hear the top reacting quite favourably to just that hit. What else can we do? Alright. Well, I think I've said a lot about this guitar. If you want to come and have a look at it, down at Studio One Vintage in Ponsonby, Auckland, New Zealand, I would definitely recommend it. There's not going to be many of these in the country for long.